Can I welcome members and witnesses to this first session in this Parliament that is a joint session of the Education Select Committee with the Work and Pensions Select Committee. I'm Helen Hayes, I'm Chair of the Education Select Committee, and halfway through this session, when we come to our second panel of witnesses, I will swap places with Debbie Abrahams, who's Chair of the Work and Pensions Committee. Can I, before we go any further, ask first of all members to introduce yourselves, and as you do so, to make any declarations of interest that you may have, and then I'll ask witnesses to introduce yourselves in a minute, and we might start with Mark at the far end there.
That's fine. Mark Sewards, Member of Parliament for Leeds South West and Morley. No declarations.
Amanda Hack, Member of Parliament for North West Leicestershire. No declarations.
Joanna Baxter, Member of Parliament for Paisley and Renfrewshire South. No declarations.
Darren Paffy, Member of Parliament for Southampton Itchen. No declarations.
Serena Brackenridge, Member of Parliament for Wolverhampton North East, and no declarations.
Debbie Abrahams, I'm the MP for Oldham East and Saddleworth and the Chair of the Work and Pensions Select Committee, and I declare that I'm a former colleague of Professor David Taylor-Robinson in Panel 2.
Jess Asato, Member of Parliament for Lowestoft. No declarations.
Damien Egan, representing Bristol North East. No declarations.
Caroline Johnson, Member of Parliament for Sleaford and North Wycombe. I'm a consultant paediatrician.
Manuela Pertegella, Member of Parliament for Stratford-on-Avon. No declarations.
Thank you very much. Can I invite Lord Blunkett, first of all, to introduce yourself to the panel, and then we'll work along to your left.
Blunkett, I'm here today because I was Education and Employment Secretary for 4 years and then latterly Work and Pensions Secretary. So I've covered the field.
I'm Naomi Eisenstadt. I think I'm here today because I was the first director of Start, but I've also got a long career in child poverty and was independent advisor to Nicola Sturgeon for 3 years on poverty.
Thank you.
I'm Anne Longfield, and I have worked for many years in this area. I ran a national charity that was very involved in the development and rollout of Sure Start Children's Centres. I was Children's Commissioner for 6 years, and I am the Executive Chair of the Centre for Young Lives.
I ought to have said, Helen, that along with other people, but primarily with Tessa Jowl, I was the initiator of Sure Start.
Thank you very much. I don't think any of us would forget that
I certainly won't.
role that you played. Thank you very much. So I'm going to begin our questioning this morning, and I'd like all three witnesses to answer, but I might perhaps start with Anne Longfield and then work in the opposite direction down the panel, if that's okay. So can I ask for your assessment of the current state of child poverty in the UK, and in particular how the recent rise in relative child poverty to 30%, which we saw in 2022-23, compares with historical trends that you've seen over the course of your work in this field? Thank you.
Well, of course, at this point, everyone says it's shocking, but we shouldn't be shocked by now because these figures have been in plain sight, in front of view for us for many years. It's appalling, it is inexcusable that a third of our children are living in poverty, and we know the impact of that in every element of their life chances is not only challenging but for many disaster. We also know that government can change that trajectory and those outcomes, and we've seen that. I'm sure we'll be delving into that in terms of what the previous Labour government was able to achieve. But the impact of it for individuals is that every element of their life chances is held back. But as a country, the economic cost and economic consequence of those individuals not being able to succeed to the extent they could is one that is limiting in every way too. We've got opportunities with the Taskforce to look at a child poverty strategy which puts its now back centre stage, and of course I want that to be ambitious. It would also be appalling to think that, you know, with the first Labour government for some time that we oversee an increase in poverty. I know no one wants that, and the leader of the party, the Chancellor, all very committed to this, but we need to be alive to the consequences and risk that it might happen unless we're bold. And that's something we absolutely need to be.
Thank you. Naomi.
Thank you. I mean, the only thing I would add to what Anne said is the impact of poverty at different life stages. And certainly the impact of poverty on under fives is much more severe because of the whole business about a good start and what it means. And I think that in some sense we've won that argument in terms of investment in early years. I will always argue there's not enough and it should be done differently. But I think that the missing piece is late adolescence. And I think the impact, the data that's just come out on NEETs in terms of 16 to 24-year-olds, that it's almost, there should be a narrative on second chance. We do not have an evidence-based narrative on young people entering into adulthood. And I think the scarring, I mean, the work that was done many, many years ago by Paul Gregg, the scarring of leaving school with no work or without work, without a positive destination, lasts well into an adult's 40s and 50s in terms of their income possibility. So I think we have to think of this as life cycle across childhood, not just early years, but it's definitely true that the longest scarring is in the early years because of the developmental opportunities that are missed, particularly for 0 to 3-year-olds.
Thank you. Blunkett.
3 things strike me immediately. One is that Naomi's mentioned, which is clearly economic inactivity at the level we're talking about with the under-25s is bound to have a devastating effect both on them but also on the wider family income, not least when they're living at home. Secondly, the level from the stats that we've been provided with, and I have to say, Chair, that I think it's quite difficult to get to accurate stats. They come from different directions, but I've not found a single source that could be said to be entirely reliable. But the statistics indicate the level of disability and family poverty has risen substantially, and that might be something, even as with only 3 weeks to go before the spending review, that government might be able to reflect on, because obviously it does have an impact overall, not just because of the challenges of those with disability moving into training and work, but also because of their income power. And I know from dealing with this myself just how horrendous it is that 3 out of 4 people with a defined disability in adulthood will not be in work. So worklessness is an obvious one. But the other aspect is clearly the change in the nature of the labour market. Very briefly, whilst we've had high levels of employment, we've had very low levels of good employment, insecure, temporary work, until the rise in the national living wage recently, quite poor pay, and that still prevails, and a flatlining of the income of most people in the country. And finally, linked to that, a massive drop in training. I mean, I'm obsessed with something for something, with conditionality, but 20 million skilled days less than 15 years ago is what we're dealing with at the moment, with a massive drop in the adult learning budget. And all these things, as this is such a complicated area, all these things really come together in a toxic mix.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting thoughts on the current state of play. Can I ask you now for your reflections on the current state of political discourse in our country, across society, on child poverty, and any progress that is already being made towards addressing it? And might start this time with Lord Blunkett.
I think there's a really genuine upsurge of concern, but it is diffuse. So there are people who are very keen to engage in cash transfer in order to overcome and ameliorate immediate poverty, which clearly, if you give people enough money, their level of poverty reduces. But it doesn't actually deal with the underlying cause of the family poverty. Children are in poverty because the family is in poverty, and helping the whole family. There was something called the Supporting Families Scheme previously rather innocuously known as the Troubled Families Scheme. That money's been rolled into, well, as far as I can gather, the Family Hubs initiative. But I'm not clear if anybody actually knows now where it's going. And that was supposed to be a holistic approach to looking at the comprehensive needs and support to a family that will help each individual be able to succeed. There's the question which has taken less salience recently of what happens to absent fathers. My mum was a single parent because she was a widow. Most children have two parents, but one of them has copped out. And I think we shouldn't duck that one either, because there should be a drive to ensure that both parents are contributing. And whether not, obviously we need cash transfer to ameliorate immediate tragedy of children on the breadline. But actually, some of that resource needs to go into enabling the family to be independent long term and to be able to drive themselves out of the pit into which they've fallen. And we have I think I call it mutuality and reciprocity. We have to do our bit, and they do their bit.
Thank you. Naomi.
Similar argument to the argument that David's making, but framed in a slightly different way. Carrie Oppenheim and I wrote a book, Parents, Poverty in the State. You know, what's the government's role in supporting families? And we did it via a sort of structure of the government's role is to reduce pressures and build capabilities. And our argument was that through the period of austerity, there was some commitment in the coalition government to build capabilities, but at the same time they were increasing pressures by benefits cuts. So the balance between how you do cash transfers and at the same time have the kind of reciprocity that David's talking about in terms of how do you build capabilities. And my line is always sort of, you know, I'll go to the parenting class if there's a free laundrette, if I can do my washing at the same time. And I think that was the sort of magic of what we did on Shore Start, was that it was a reciprocal agreement between local families, what they thought would help them, and what professionals thought they needed. And too much of what we do, I think, is about what we wish they'd want, and somehow we get annoyed when they don't. So that balance between, I mean, cash transfers is part of reducing pressures, but also good parental leave reduces pressures. There's flexibility at work reduces pressures. Quality of work reduces pressures. So cash transfers is a very important part of the picture, but it's not the only part of the picture. But I don't think that we can do the things that will improve family home learning environment, the stuff that we know really matters to children, if we are not reducing pressures on families.
I agree with entirely that it's both cash transfers and that springboard to support that sense that you're standing alongside people to be able to support them to become financially independent. And I think we know how that works. We've seen it work before. We have had a massive dilution of that infrastructure of support over the last 15 years, the Sure Starts, the family hubs, the supporting families. And I suppose what we've also had is we've had COVID, which rocket boosted so many of those insecurities, and we saw that, and it's become really baked in. What we didn't say in the first one, of course, is that most families with children that are in poverty are actually working now. So that is a difference to, a couple of decades ago, and that is for all the reasons we've heard about. But of course, we are now the discussion is about how do we resolve, how do we reduce poverty. I felt over recent years, sometimes it was almost a squeamishness of talking about poverty. So, this is the moment really where we can start action, which is what most families that don't have enough money really want, and long-term action. Then we've also realised the cost of not doing anything, the cost of crisis, because, we're now helping for the same money, fewer and fewer children with more and more acute needs. And that means that most children actually are getting less and less because the cost of crisis is so high. It's not sustainable for us as an economy. So we have to reset ourselves towards really helping all families. But that help has to be alongside with a, respectful, challenging, supportive relationship about how do we help you get to a different place. And again, there's many examples from the past of how that can be done. But I would say it's complicated. People's lives are complicated. And that respect and having people with trusted relationships is what people need, but also for the long term. This has to be a 10, 20-year vision.
And Foden, and we'll go to Manuela for the next question.
Thank you, Chair. There are several poverty measurements and many recommendations on measures of living standards. So my question to the panel is, what measures of poverty, material deprivation, or other indicators of poverty do you think are most useful in discussions and actions on child poverty? And can I start with Lord Blunkett, please?
Yes, I'm aware that Roundtree have been doing some work on what would be, in our country at this moment in time, a baseline for living acceptably. In other words, try and cut through the absolute and relative poverty arguments. I'm also familiar with the Social Metrics Commission, although I have some real doubts about how calculations are made. We can't use averages.
That's right.
Michael Gove once said he wanted all schools to be at the average. Well, once you've got the average has changed, and all the calculations you have to make are have people floated up or have people floated down, normally the former, hopefully, rather than you very rarely get the latter, let's put it that way. So incomes very rarely come down as a cohort. So if we can get incomes up, the average changes. And so Roundtree have been trying to do something about what would it look like to have an income that allowed you to live acceptably. And I think that's a much better way of approaching it. It's difficult because you've got to have a starting point and you've got to work towards it. But otherwise, you're always chasing your tail. I mean, we could argue all morning about what is absolute poverty. We could argue about what is relative in a situation which I described a minute or two ago, where we've had a decade where general incomes have flatlined. They're rising now because incomes are rising, earned incomes are rising above inflation, and the national living wage has risen above inflation. And so there is a gradual increase in income generally, which is bound to have an impact on people's living standards. So I'm very keen that we try and get off something that moves as you move, because otherwise we'll never get there. You're bound. In fact, the more the average goes up, the more people will fall into your definition of poverty. So you never get yourself out of it. Sorry, it's something that exercises me, especially reading the Social Metrics Commission stuff.
Right, well, I'm going to reference some of the work that David just spoke about. Donald Hirsch did the original work that the Roundtree stuff is based on, and he did work on what's called a minimum income standard. And the trouble, I mean, it's brilliant work, but the difficulty on establishing a poverty line, or what a minimum income standard is it is incredibly variable depending on where you live.
And forgive me, this is not universal basic income.
No, it absolutely isn't.
No.
Completely isn't universal basic income, which anyway, I won't comment on that. But the minimum income standard is really quite interesting, because what they did was they did, multifaceted focus groups all around the country about, to be a participant as a citizen, what's the minimum that you need? And there was huge variability. And for example, part of the variability in London, it was a meal out, like once a month, because people have much smaller kitchens in London and they can't have people over for meals. And the really interesting one, I mean, I was then a trustee of the Trust for London, so we commissioned Donald to do it just for London. And the housing costs in London are just beyond anywhere else in the rest of the country. But it's Loughborough University that did this work. They also did it, and we looked at it when I was doing the poverty work for the Scottish government. And believe it or not, what's really, really expensive is being in the Highlands and Islands in Scotland, where they're not particularly poor in terms of income, but the cost of living is massive because it's so cold and because everything has to be flown in.
Yeah.
Everything has to be flown in. So their access to a pediatric child psychiatrist was once a month. So if your child needed that kind of help, you had to take them to the mainland. So working out what it should be regionally, working out what it should be depending on where you live, and working out the public acceptance for the idea of what a minimum standard looks like, I think is really, really important. But I do think the round-tree work is brilliant.
I'd just add to that, really. I think we need to set on one definition and pretty sharpish, and I think Roundtree's is going in a good place. My frustration has been that we spend so many months, years even, arguing about what is poverty and what isn't poverty. You talk to any family or child that's living in poverty and they'll be able to tell you in, the rawest detail of what it means day in, day out, and for some, everything about the agony of that. So it needs to reflect real lives. It needs to be able to reflect the kind of different lifestyles that we've heard about. I think also the understanding of regional disparities and entrenched poverty and the impact of that is slightly beyond the notion of what is a measure, but that is something where different aspects combine and have a particular deep impact. But I think, the time for discussion on it is kind of over. We just need to go for it and understand. And then it moves on to the next question, of course, is what would a good outcome look like? And how would a measurement enable you to get there? But we'll come to that.
Thank you. You've touched a little on the question that I was going to ask, which is about how important do you think it is for poverty measures to take account of individual circumstances? So, for example, those sort of inescapable costs you've referred to. I mean, obviously in the north of Scotland, energy prices is one, but thinking also about costs related perhaps to disability and childcare, and looking at the work that the Social Metrics Commission has done that Lord Blunkett referred to already. So I don't know if we want to start with Baroness Longfield and then work out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to reflect real life. What we don't want is this to become, a dot on a graph or a data point. It has to be real enough to reflect real life, and of course that's what the Social Metrics Commission took us into. How do we do that? And I think also, that broader discussion around Joseph Rowntree work around, the views of individuals and what it would mean to be able to have an income that would enable you to be able to have a baseline income. But again, I suppose I just go to the frustration of it's a job to be done. It needs to be done well. It needs to reflect real life. However, it needs to be done quickly because we need to move on from this because the real work comes in how you actually change things and reduce poverty and move families to a better place.
Mm-hmm. Just to add to that, I mean, the issue of disability is I imagine, is close to all our hearts. It makes it more difficult if there are two adults in the family, it makes it more difficult for both adults to work full time. And if there's only one adult struggling to work part time and look after someone with support someone with severe disabilities, obviously you're going to have to tailor what you're doing to help them the most. So these are quite tricky delivery aspects, aren't they? Because you're having to try and tailor what you do, not to people fitting in with the system, but the system backing people.
Thank you.
So just, I mean, the difficulty is, and it's sort of the framing is really important for me, is that the reason that the government brought in universal credit was we had an impossibly complex benefit system that even benefits advisors found it really difficult. On the other hand, the simpler you make it, the more rigid it is, and the less capable it is of being flexible for various disabilities, for ages of children, for lone parents. And that balance between flexible but overly complex, simple and rigid is something that policymakers really struggle with. So there isn't an easy answer to it. But there is, I think that Anne's right about coming to some notion about what is a decent living, and then working out in different family circumstances how you ensure that happens, I think is the task. But I think having been involved both locally with very poor families and also, in government on policy, it's easy to ask the questions, it's really hard to deliver them.
And how crucial is the depoliticisation of discussions on child poverty and facilitating meaningful progress in tackling it? Do you think? Who wants to start? Lord Blunkett?
Go on, David.
I think it's extremely difficult. I'm so old that I go back so far that I remember in the lead up to the 1992 general election, forgive me for a second in reminiscing, but there was a very substantial commitment by the then Labour Party, the Shadow Chancellor was John Smith, to a massive cash transfer. It undoubtedly lost us the general election. So you sometimes have to make a decision as to whether you want to make progress slowly or whether you want to make no progress at all. And that was about people who felt that they were being asked, and they were struggling, to provide to others who they didn't necessarily believe were putting in the same shift. Now, it could be completely untrue, but in politics, perception is very important. So taking people with you in terms of the something for something and knowing that you're doing the right thing, but you're also doing the right thing for the medium and long term as well, is really tricky. Because on the one hand, you can be seen as completely heartless, and there's plenty of that about. On the other, you can be a complete soft touch and actually not achieve what you set out to achieve because you feel better about it. Yeah. But has it changed the lives of the people that you really care about?
I think there is a political framing that I get very annoyed about. So this is where and that's, are you blaming the individual or are you blaming the system? And there was a lot of blaming the individual. There was a lot of redefining poverty. In the last segment, redefining poverty about lone parent or alcohol and drug problems, or defining it in terms of the behaviors of the family in poverty. And the truth is, it was disrespectful to poor people. And that's what really infuriated me about it, is that there are a lot of poor people who don't beat each other up and don't drink too much, and that they just don't have enough money. And I think we have to separate out, and I think that is a political argument in the sense of how you get, how you win it over in terms of what David is saying. Of course, it's really, really important that you win over the electorate, otherwise you can't do anything. On the other hand, I think blaming the poor is wicked.
So I'd agree with that. And also, we all know down this end what happens when, you do get alongside people who do want to change the situation they're in, and with a very, sometimes, small amount of help and support, you can help them just, absolutely go to a different place. So it's not that you're in some way having to garner long-term dependency. This is about knowing what people need and stand alongside them. However, just going back to the kind of, I guess, the political buy-in within this place, not really the rest of the country, although I do think COVID actually brought a reality of what being poor and having amount to climb day in, day out, it brought it into more people's understanding. They knew what it meant to live in poor accommodation because they heard about it more, they saw it, whereas they wouldn't normally. Obviously, people move on and not everyone remembers, but I do think that there was something happened there. In terms of in here, well, we saw the consequence when there wasn't that political buy-in last time, where Sure Starts were starting to be dismantled before some of them were even open, where the Child Poverty Act was dismantled in 2015, and where, you know, the move away from that cash transfer now, you know, these things happen, but we have to make sure that this is something that absolutely is rooted in that common belief, I think, that everyone has, that actually we all want as many of our kids to succeed as possible. We all want our country to grow well and be as prosperous as it can be. And then that understanding that some kids need extra help and some families need extra help for that to be possible. I think if we ground it in that way, with that kind of what I still think is relatively a measured way of you know, moving forward to help families, actually it's more likely to get that political buy-in across the piece, and more likely to be something I think the families know that everyone needs a bit of help now and again, and actually this is something which has been good for everyone.
Chair, indulge me for a second. On the point Anne's made about lived experience, I've never been better off in my life now, for all kinds of reasons, because some of the burdens are lifted off me as well. I have to nip myself to remember what it was like as a child, where there was literally bread and dripping in the house. I have to do it because otherwise you get completely detached, and quite a lot of the debate around this. When the £20 supplement was withdrawn, I kept having to remind myself I would pay that for a bottle of wine for a Saturday night. And for other people, it was a lifeline to actually eating reasonably. So, I mean, these perceptions are really important.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. We'll go to Mark Sewitz now for the next question.
Thank you very much, Chair. So thinking broadly about the new Labour government, the coalition government that followed, the Conservative governments that came after that, what changes to social security policy over that entire time had the biggest impact on child poverty? And in addition to that, were there things outside of social security policy, outside of the government's control, direct control, that also had an impact?
Sure Start, full employment, and the child tax credit system. But Robert Reich, who was way back in the 90s, the Labour Secretary in the US, was in a meeting that I was in with Gordon Brown, and he said to Gordon, he said, it's a really good idea, this, but he said the government don't get the credit for tax credits. And of course he was right. So a combination of those things, I think, made a significant difference. It was true that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, supported by the Prime Minister, really believed strongly that this was a moral imperative and that we need to do something about it. But it was a mixture underpinned by the things that Naomi and Anne are talking about, not least because we loved Sure Start, because it transported the lives of adults and not just of children. It wasn't just about nurturing and developing the child, critical as that was, and it wasn't just about professionals coming in and then leaving at tea time. It was about a transformation of the community. You've chided me before that I still believe in communitarianism and building from the community, and you can make a big difference, not just to the lives of individuals, but to their ambition, their hope, their expectation of what's possible for them, if you get this right.
Thank you, Lord Blunkett. Naomi.
Okay, so this my colleagues may disagree with, but I think it's about the evidence on Sure Start. Sure Start worked when it was targeted in the poorest areas. When it was rolled out across the country for everywhere, the effectiveness, it wasn't enough in the poorest areas, and for the non-poor areas it didn't make a difference because there wasn't so far to travel. So I think the notion about geographical targeting in neighborhoods is really, really important in terms of what we know from the evidence actually worked. And I think I think that everybody has a different think bubble about Sure Start. But I do think that notion about targeting in the poorest areas is extraordinarily important. The second point, which is again picking up on David's point, I think one of the reasons it worked is I wasn't terribly popular amongst my colleagues because I made the staff go out to the centres. I made them visit. And the nature of the civil service is really clever people who are largely drawn from a particular class who had never been on these estates, who had never spoken to people, who live on these estates. And they came back absolutely astounded. And I think that link between national policy and how people live their lives was extraordinarily important. And, the other thing, just one more thing that was interesting is that I wouldn't let the civil servants who worked in the unit travel first class because the local partners know what edge of the train you get off when you visit. And I think things like that were symbolic. This is an anti-poverty program. We don't go first class on the train. Now nobody's allowed to go first class anymore, but in those days, it was grade related. And some of the the higher grade staff were slightly irritated about that. It is something about, as far as you can, understanding what it is you're trying to do for whom.
Thank you very much, Naomi. And Baroness Longfield.
You're obviously getting the idea that Short Start was a good thing down this end, but obviously David's right in terms of cash transfers as well. But the thing about the pullback from Short Start was that actually it left people alone back where they were to just, get by. The thing about Short Start was that it translated policy from a government, always government, the machinery of government's never that easy to be able to come together in terms of real people's lives. But Short Start did that. So when government went out and delivered Short Start, and Naomi had them all over, people on buses and trains all over the place doing that, it was actually behind the scenes was lots and lots of government departments, as there was around the poverty strategy that was feeding into that, be that health, be that education, be that childcare, be that work, all of those things. So it almost felt to communities that you'd got a government that actually wanted to come to you on your terms. Because when that goes, you're left to rattle around for your own devices. And that when that comes at a point where actually, work becomes more insecure, when you have, COVID comes along and the like, then, you get that feeling where actually there's no one on your side. You have to navigate your housing office, you have to navigate your school. Every one of those is a mountain to climb, whereas actually if you have people on your side, they can often help you through some of those things. So I think the impact, obviously for communities, but for individuals, is something about leaving people slightly to sink or swim.
And you'll have seen the Institute for Fiscal Studies work on the original Sure Start programme, to pick up your point, Naomi, which is very interesting and for some of us extremely rewarding. And the other bit that Anne's just touched on, just in passing, we didn't build enough houses from 1997, we all know that, but there was a massive refurbishment programme in the social housing sector in particular, and I think that did make a difference to people's lives. Poverty isn't just about the money, it's the circumstance in which you're living.
Thank you very much. Very definitive answer. I'll hand back to the chair.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to bring Caroline Johnson in. Can I just mention, we're hoping to be able to finish this panel by 5 to 11 to enable Lord Blunkett, I think he's got to give evidence at another select committee somewhere else on the estate. I've got 5 more members who want to ask you questions. So if I can encourage you to be succinct both on the questioning and the answering, then we'll get through everybody and enable Lord Blunkett to get away when he needs to as well. Caroline.
Just ask a bit more about the Sure Start. I remember from having young children around that time myself that Sure Start offered some really very good opportunities for babies, baby classes, baby massage classes, lots of things, but they were attended in my area almost entirely by parents who didn't necessarily need them in terms of relatively well-off parents. It wasn't well targeted. Now, Naomi, you've mentioned targeting by postcode and estates, has been mentioned as well, but actually in a town or a city, that might work where the geography suits that. But how do you target that in rural areas where poverty is much more hidden by the postcode averages? And how do you encourage people to attend those events? Because what I saw in my locality was that the events for the Sure Start were held in the Sure Start Centre. They were put in areas of relatively high deprivation, but they were still attended more by those who were not economically deprived. So how do you get those services to the people who actually really need them?
I thought we were going to do a few.
So, no. We'll go one at a time, but if you could just be as succinct as you can be.
I'll be really quick. The issue about non-poor using them, there was good social mix, and that it benefits both communities to mix. Some areas were not as good at doing the outreach, and some, and particularly NHS organisations, were not cooperative in terms of giving us the data on where people live so you could do the home visits. So if you had the data on where the people who you thought needed it the most lived and did home visits and then you bring them in, the whole principle of open access but locating in poor areas is really important. We did have a special exception in terms of rural areas, and the way it worked in rural areas was to link it to whatever was there in a rural area already. So it was in Gloucestershire, we did the centre attached to a leisure centre that had swimming and all that kind of stuff. In the northeast, we attached them to disused fire stations. So you just looked for where there was a building in a rural area, and then you did a lot of outreach. It costs more in rural areas, there's no question, but you can do it. But you have to have good data, and sometimes we had the good data, sometimes we didn't.
Can I just add to that? There was good social mix in many. It depended where you were. If you were in Peckham, then obviously you'd get lots of people from, the wealthier areas around it coming because it was great. If you were in outer Lancashire, in a very poor, deprived, outer urban place, you'd probably not. You'd get people within that estate. But also, each one of them was what you make of them. They were different. They were open for different lengths of time. They were in different levels of sophistication, the centres themselves. And they were only in their first few years of operation. So they were all in their infancy and learning when you go along. One thing I'd just say is the data that Naomi's talked about, getting that NHS data. My charity used to run some. I mean, it took years sometimes to even start to get some, how can you actually start to, target, for want of a better word, and reach out to those families if you don't actually have the data of who they are.
You don't know where the babies are that have just born.
And so, that's really important.
I should be very brief. There are cities, London obviously, where there's poverty and reasonable wealth side by side. My own city's not like that.
Yeah.
It's split right down the middle.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to get them mixed.
Serena.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to consider what impact the national minimum wage and increases to eligibility and rate of payment made to child poverty. And I'll start with Lord Blunkett, please.
Yeah, well, national minimum wage was a bit of a campaign along with Rodney Bickerstaff and Ian McCartney. People forget, the massive effort that went in. It was transformational in two ways. Obviously, if you have a national minimum now, national living wage, you're immediately lifting the floor, but you're also changing the terms and conditions of people relative to their employer. So at last, people were beginning to see that you were valued and that it was worth going into work. So I'll just leave it at that, really. If it's worth going to work, it's worth going to work. Mm-hmm. And the problem with the balance of benefits, in-work benefits as well as out-of-work benefits, is trying to get that balance right. Because people are human and they react in normal psychological ways. And if it's not worth it, it's not worth it.
Yeah.
Okay, Naomi?
I agree with David.
Absolutely agree. Okay. So, to what extent should the successive governments rely on increases to national minimum wage and the national living wage to further address child poverty? So, Lord Blunkett,
personally,
I will go to you again.
I'm very keen that we have just seen a relative, percentage-wise. Alan Fisher, who was once the General Secretary of the National Union of Public Employees, of which I was a member, said 100% of bugger all is bugger all. Sorry, I'm not supposed to do that in select committees, but that's what he said. So the relative increase is really important. Keeping the pressure up on that actually creates cries from small businesses, understandably, particularly in retail, and saying, well, the trade-off is between employing people or not employing people. I don't believe that. I believe if you do it carefully and steadily, you can raise people's living standards, they have money to spend in the local community, and you alleviate their poverty. It's got to be morally the right thing to do.
Two things to say. One is that the point about poor people will spend their money locally. That's really, really important. But the other thing is that employment is good for your mental health. It brings you into social contact. It gives you a reason to get up in the morning. So high quality work is actually beneficial, not just in terms of poverty, but in terms of one's sense of self-esteem and mental health. And it's good role modeling for children.
And what we want is to help as many families as possible be financially independent as possible. So it's absolutely at the core of the way we're going to get there.
Thank you.
I think we've obviously already discussed some of the key areas of policy that have really made a difference on educational, social and well-being for children and the trying to mitigate the impacts of child poverty. So I won't ask what your view is in what's the most effective policy. I think we've had that answer already. So I'm just looking at some specific measures, if I may please. Things like pupil premium and the education maintenance allowance. What impact do you think they had on child poverty?
Pupil premium, I think, has helped in terms of lifting the investment in children in specific schools, because obviously it's based per pupil, but it cumulatively makes a big difference to what the school can do. We piloted this under the heading of pupil learning credit between 2000 and 2002, and then the Treasury, in quotes, rolled it in to the general budget, and then of course it was reinvented under the coalition, and I think there's a lot we could still do with that. I mentioned the IFS earlier. I had a meeting with Paul Johnson and his colleagues because they don't like what came out of the education maintenance allowance, but in 2006 there was a longitudinal study which showed the impact had been very substantial in helping young people to stay in college post-16 and to be able to make the choice as to what they wanted to do, and by staying on have different opportunities that would otherwise not have been available to them. But the argument is that if you get young people connected with the world of work earlier, they might actually stay in and get a job. Well, that's fine, but tell that to those whose sole ambition for their children is to go to university. So it's again, nothing simple about this, except it's self-evident if you put the money, as Naomi said earlier, very clearly focused, targeted, and you know what you're doing with it, and you join it up with other programmes. And I've just stressed before we finish, joined upness is such an important part of what we need to do. And we did it with Sure Start. We didn't do it in other areas of government. There's no question about that. And the challenge for the government is to make the commission, the missions real, so that something's actually happening that joins up the bits, because together there is quite a lot of resource, even with all the pressures on the Treasury. There's a lot of resource. Most of it is being dealt with in tramlines rather than together.
Just very quickly, one thing that hasn't got a mention yet, but I think is really, really important, is early education and childcare. And again, there is a tension between the quality of the childcare and childcare that is affordable and accessible. And I think that we have erred too far on the side of affordable, accessible in terms of employment, and not enough on the quality of the staff working with young children. And there's very, very good evidence on this. The best universal lift you can do is high quality early education. And the structures are in place, they're there. It's just not, the quality is not good enough. So we should be working on that.
And I'd say just on that, I mean, we're investing now a substantial amount in childcare compared to where we were years ago, but it's not done in a way which actually has that mission-driven approach, which would start to release more money for the things that Naomi's talking about there. The other part is around how we have the early education, the childcare, but also the child development acting as one, and not wanting to go back to Sure Start, but obviously, and family hubs. The potential is there to do that. But all of these things, you have to make them happen, and you have to make them join up. At the moment, it's like, you know, what we've had is the machine of government serves up kind of ingredients to make a meal, but not enough to make a meal in itself. And actually, you know, we need to use the engine of government to lean into this, because that's where we'll start to see the movement we want to see.
And Chair, it's outside my remit, your remit, but we've got two different ministers, one dealing with childcare, the other dealing with family hubs, and two different budgets.
Yeah.
Well, make your own decision about that.
Yeah. I think that's a really useful point to go on to the next point around actually the departments of government and how do you pull those together to have more impact. Going back to Sure Start, I think, you know, there was some real signs of looking at reductions in 0 to 5s in terms of accidents and attendance at A&E, looking at their development age at the point at which they went into primary school. So there was a lot of connecting. So what other things do you think we can do to look across departments to try and deal with child poverty?
Well, I mean, first of all, when you had a child poverty unit, that is something I'd strongly advocate for. That's something which, I mean, David will tell you much more about the workings, but what you had then was a unit that worked on behalf of the government overall, to look at all departments, to measure progress, to support progress, and I guess to challenge progress as well. I think also leadership from the top was a really important part of that and that drive. But that then brought together all of these things, because of course, you know, real people don't live their lives in compartments that relate necessarily to government departments. So a unit of this kind as a mechanism across government, I think we've lost some of the mechanisms, the engines, which allow joined up policies to become reality for people, and those are the areas that I think we need to rebuild.
Really briefly, if you can, because we're
very quickly. Leadership from the top. The Prime Minister believing in it and the Chancellor believing in it will make it happen. Secondly, I have this strong view about love and money, and no matter where you put things, there's always going to be joins. And you always have to manage. There is no perfect structure for government. There's no perfect structure for anything. There will always be joins. And one of the example I can give you is Sure Start was magic because both Tessa Jowell and David were old friends and agreed on what they wanted to achieve. And one was in education and one was in health. And that magic of actually for ministers getting on with each other and wanting for the same things to happen, I think, how do you make that happen? You can't. On the other hand, you have to look at those relationships and figure out how do you make people work towards the same ends, even if they're in different departments, because you can't bring it all together. It's too complicated, and there'll always be joins.
I'm only in the Thatcher room, so give me 1 minute. Professor Carol Black produced an excellent report on the back of which we set up a joint unit between work and pensions and health, which I presume still exists. And what we didn't do was then translate that into the local. So Job Centre Plus and the local health service at place level, as opposed to what is now the ICBs, which is a piece of bureaucracy, could have done a replica of that working group, and I would strongly recommend it.
Agree. Can I go to Damien for our next question? We'll understand, Lord Blunkett, if you need to leave us at this point. And thank you very much for being with us this morning.
Thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you. Thank you.
Lovely to see you, Dave.
It's nice to get it off my chest.
To have provided the opportunity for that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Naomi. Thank you.
See you soon.
Thanks, Anne.
Thank you. Thank you.
I've got a couple of questions back on Sure Start, but you've covered much of the angle. But Naomi, I was really interested when you talked about the reciprocal agreement with the Sure Start users, because I wanted to ask about the importance of local input. My background was local government, so when I think of that, I think of, right, speak to the council, local agencies, health. I hadn't caught on that bit around actually engaging with people who be using the service. And so the example you gave about, can I get my washing done, was really interesting to me. So I wondered if you could draw out other examples or the process of how that worked. And then I'll add in the kind of other question I had was, we've got the more recent programme around the family hubs and how that compares to Sure Start. And perhaps if I might just add on to that, the different challenges that families might have and kind of the parenting skills that would be needed through the family hubs, which would be different in today's environment than they were in the past.
I'll give you a really good specific example on the reciprocity question. Yeah. So we required in the first 60 trailblazers that evidence in the plan that they submitted. This was not every area that we chose that was very, very poor was going to get one. So it wasn't competitive. It was more, you got the money when we agreed the plan. And part of the plan was, did you speak to local parents? We had a test for whether they spoke to local parents, and it was dog poo. So if they spoke to local parents, so they came back and said, we spoke to local parents and they wanted more health visitors and speech therapists. And we knew they spoke to health visitors and speech therapists. If they spoke to local parents and said, we're worried about the dog do in the park, we're worried about needles, we're worried about broken glass, we don't like, they were worried about the environment. They didn't ask for more services.
Yeah.
And that notion about understanding what it's like to live in these very, very poor areas and how scary it is to leave your house, and make sure your kids don't get, ill because they're playing in areas that are really unclean. So that was a really good example of reciprocity. And we actually had advance fund, this is the golden day, £50,000 advance capital funding to do whatever you wanted before the program was approved, to convince people this is really going to happen. This is really for you. So it was about working with people on what was important to them and then talking to them on what we think is good for their children. I can bore for England on this, so I'll stop.
So you
speak to the family hubs?
Yes.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course.
Super brief, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. All of those things. I'd just say as well that none of this is about soft, easy options for families. You've got someone who is bugging them all the time. Have you got your housing sorted? Have you done this? But I'll leave that one there. The family hubs, well, I think, for ease, we should think that family hubs and children's centres could be in the same place. The amount that's spent, we've just at the Centre for Young Lives undertaken research and FOIs for local authorities with 80% results. The amount that's been spent at the moment is about a quarter as much, and 40% of the centres have closed. So the amount that's going in is much, much less. However, there is something there to be built upon. What you have is now an ambition about an extended age range, 0 to 19. Again, we can discuss this even between us for many hours at a time. But the starting point for most has been, most of the attention, like 80-90% of it has been on under fives already. So family hubs have, I think most people will say we don't actually care what we call them. What we want is really high quality services that are in the areas that need to be, that have that depth of quality that's able to deliver the results we want, which is about raising people out of poverty. At the moment, family hubs are pretty disparate. There are relatively few. But if you combine those with children's centres and start to rebuild, we think it will cost about £1 billion to take you to a first phase and £2 billion to take you to about 200 million children, but it's quite possible to do. It falls into the land if you've got to want to do it, and then it starts being able to repay its investment.
Thank you. Jess?
How effective was the Child Poverty Act in 2010, and should we have another one with a clear target to reduce child poverty set out in law?
Go ahead. No.
All right. I think, again, it was in its infancy. What was important that it embodied the targets, and with that then also the mechanisms within government to reach them. Can't overstate the importance of those mechanisms, because again, none of this happens by itself. It has to be a determination, it has to be an obsession. So whether legislation is needed or not, the targets in my view are absolutely needed, because it focuses mind, it has clarity over what good outcomes look like, which, you know, we can all think we know, but actually there'll be many, many views. And then also it really drives the different parts of government to effectively work together at its best. Obviously you have to make that happen too.
Thank you. Naomi?
Well, it wasn't effective because we have more poor children than we had in 2010. Evidence is that it wasn't effective. We did it because we thought that once you put in legislation it would last, but it was very easy to unpick.
Yeah.
So I think that, you know, how do you make it so it can't be unpicked? I don't know what the answer to that is, but the evidence is we had a child poverty legislation and child poverty went up.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll just go to Darren for our last question, if that's okay.
Thank you. It's a nice, light, easy one to finish with. What can you tell us your views on the current government's approach to developing its child poverty strategy? And the second part of that is, do you think there are any key areas that we as a committee should focus on in our work?
Go ahead.
Shall we start?
Yeah.
Well, the first thing to say is there is a child poverty strategy being delivered, so that is a very welcome change. Also, the unit was established straight away, so that again is great to see. We, of course, are awaiting the outcome. There's been a lot of discussion and debate, and I welcome the fact that it's been both about, you know, the financial transfer and support for people's real lives. In terms of, you know, what comes out, well, you know, there's big discussions about things like the 2-cat limit, which, you know, I know is a very live issue. It's the way you'd get the most instant response. By itself, it's not going to be the driving force, but it removes something which we know is putting so many children in poverty, and one that, you know, absolutely support. The whole issue about how you actually drive and coordinate government into action, which we've banged on about down this end the whole way through, has to be part of what that strategy is able to deliver. And then those ambitious targets for the long term, because of course, you know, this is very much in the discussion now. It's kind of raised and heightened status now, but it's going to take long slogs, and that's what families want. You know, they don't want a headline, they want a long slog over 5, 10, 20 years that actually means we drive down in a very determined way the poverty which we know is avoidable if we can get our public services, our public money, and our relationship with families and communities to work together. And I think that's what the ambition has to be.
Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm not going to answer the question because there's something I want to say that's slightly different. I think there's another real difficulty in how we carve policy in terms of, is it the 30% or the 5% or the 2%? And my view is that Sure Start and other big programs were about the 30% in terms of poverty levels. And that as soon as you get down to the 5% and the 2%, you've got families with very, very complex difficulties, what the Treasury used to call high cost, high harm. But you won't shift the curve. So you could spend all your money on children in care and not shift the curve on child poverty. So you have to be quite difficult with yourself and quite disciplined on what is it you're trying to achieve. It's not that you don't do the other things, but legally we have to do them. But what are you trying to achieve, and how do you, and if you go for the 30%, your unit costs are much less, because it takes a little bit to shift people over. I mean, Anne said this as well. It doesn't take a lot of money per unit cost where it does in the highly complex families. And I think the reason that I link that to things like supporting families and family hubs became for the 3 to 5%, not the 30%. They became very social work focused. They became focused very much on individual family difficulties. I hate the word vulnerable. I really hate it because it implies some weakness within the family rather than, you know what my problem is, I just don't have enough money. So if we think more carefully and about our language, we will make more progress.
Sure Start became something you were referred to, and that's not what we want. We want somewhere people see as part of their community and they're able to participate in. I think all of those points are really well made, but ultimately, we have to make the money we have available work for those families. And it's been leaning away from so many of those families for so long. We need to lean it back in.
Thank you very much. On that note, can I thank both of you very much for coming to give evidence to us this morning, and ask that we change over to our second panel of witnesses, and Debbie and I will also swap places.
Thank you.
Order, and a very warm welcome to our second panel for this inaugural Child Poverty Inquiry session. It's a pleasure to welcome Katriona, sorry if I got the pronunciation wrong there, Katriona O'Sullivan, David Taylor Robinson, Mike Brewer and Tom Waters. Would you just like to introduce yourselves and the organisation you represent, starting with Katriona?
So I'm Professor Katriona O'Sullivan.
Katriona, I'm so sorry.
I am the Director for the Centre for Inclusive Higher Education in Maynooth University in Ireland. I actually grew up poor. I'm one of the high-cost 5% families in the middle of England, Hillfields, lone parents, benefit dependent, homeless, wicked. And I'm one of the only women I know who've actually not only escaped their destiny, because poverty is a destiny, the same way privilege is. I'm actually thriving. And so I'm here to talk about the people and the policies and the practices that actually saved me.
Hi there, I'm Professor David Taylor Robinson. I'm a Professor of Public Health and Policy at the University of Liverpool and consultant in child public health at Alder Hey Children's Hospital in Liverpool.
Hello, I'm Mike Brewer, the Deputy Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation.
Hi, I'm Tom Waters. I'm an Associate Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, I'm also part of the Expert Advisory Group for the Child Poverty Strategy.
Thank you. And our first question is from Jessa Sato.
Thank you so much. What is your assessment of the current state of child poverty in the UK? How has this changed over time, and to what extent has the two-child limit had an impact on our trends of child poverty? I'll go to Tom first.
Typically we think of two kinds of poverty. We think of absolute and relative poverty, and we think about income poverty. And over longer periods of time, we usually expect absolute poverty to fall as incomes generally rise. The number of people below a fixed income line tends to decline. Relative poverty, it's less clear. It's how well are lower income families keeping up with those around the middle. And if we look at recent trends in absolute poverty, there's not been a tremendous amount of change the last 10 to 15 years, depending exactly which time period you're looking at. Maybe you can talk about a 1 or a 2 percentage point fall, but that would be quite small compared to historical standards where we tended to see absolute poverty decline. Relative poverty has gone up in recent years, certainly since 2010. And it does look like there that the two-child limit probably is an important contributing factor. If you look at families that have 1 or 2 kids, their relative child poverty has fallen, whereas it's increased for those with 3 or more children. And that's actually enough to bring the overall child poverty rate rising.
Thank you. Mike?
Thank you. In terms of how the nature of child poverty has changed over a kind of 2 or 3 decade time period, as the previous panel have said, there's more working poverty now because just more parents are working, but they're finding that their earnings is not enough to get them over the poverty line. And I'd say housing costs are a bigger drag on poverty, with poverty becoming a little more skewed towards those in social housing and the private rented sector. The 2010s definitely saw relative poverty begin to creep up again, and that was driven by larger families. I think the two-child limit is definitely important in that, but actually the rise started before 2017, and that's because in the first half of the 2010s, the government was cutting back in tax credits and uprating benefits more slowly than inflation, and cutting back on local housing allowance. So it's not just the two-child limit that matters for large families, it's the whole package of income they get from the benefit system, because for a large family in poverty, the benefit system is providing a huge amount of their income.
Thank you. David?
We're seeing a child poverty crisis. We know that 31% of kids, 1 in 3, are in relative income poverty. That's 4.5 million children. It's 35% of children in the northwest. It's 40% of kids where I work in Liverpool. And as part of the Child of the North initiative, we collected everyday stories of poverty and hardship. We heard about parents using watered down evaporated milk in babies' bottles because of the cost of formula, children routinely turning up to school without shoes, schools buying kit and shoes for pupils. In Alderhay, we regularly see kids not able to attend medical appointments because of the cost of appointments. And we know a lot about the epidemiology of poverty. We know that it's much greater risk in lone parent families, 43% of children, in families with other axes of inequality. So if you in a family with a disability, it's 44%, double the risk of poverty in ethnic minority families. And it's clear from trends over time, poverty reached a peak in the early 90s, 35% relative poverty. There was a clear reduction under the new Labour strategy and as part of the English health inequality strategy. And then we've seen all of that reversed under the banner of austerity. And I guess, speaking from a public health perspective, it's crystal clear how those poverty trends have impacted the really dire health trends that we're seeing for children and for adults at the moment.
I think for me, I think more people are experiencing pressure in terms of financial pressure. So we're talking more about poverty now, but my experience of poverty myself as a young person, going to school with wet pants, not being washed, having to be given food in school because I didn't have it at home because my family couldn't feed me. I think that changed with the change of the Labour government in the late 90s. And now I think we're seeing them experiences more and more. Every day I get messages, I wrote a book about this, every day I get messages about teachers who are experiencing children who can't participate in education because they're hungry. And that's not necessarily just to do with employment issues. That hard case of poverty seems to have got more entrenched and more difficult. And I think one of the difficulties is the rhetoric that's gone on in the last 15 years about who's responsible, the individualisation of poverty, the way in which we're taught you can change your own life, you need to work harder, you need to do better in school, actually makes people feel that they're actually responsible for for their own poverty and their own difficulties, which is completely untrue. The idea of choice in poverty is a myth. I had no choice as a young person growing up in the middle of in hill fields in large class sizes, with no consistent benefit support, with no mental health support for my family, no food in the schools, even just the cutting of the free school meals. The only meal I had in the day was the free school meal. And the idea that that's been reduced and that families are being taught that it's their responsibility to engage in services or to do better for themselves, that is really harmful, because you walk around feeling responsible when really the system is responsible.
Thank you. Mark Sewitz.
Thank you very much, Chair. I asked the last panel this question, and their definitive answer was the Sure Start centres had the biggest impact. But over the last 25 years, what changes to social security policy have had the biggest positive changes to child poverty, and what changes have had the most negative impact to child poverty? Is it okay if I start with Dr. O'Sullivan for this one?
I actually can't answer it fully. I can talk from my own experience. So in terms of social security, what got me out of poverty was secure housing and secure benefits. So I grew up and I was socialised into being completely benefit dependent. So that was what I was taught. You get your benefits and you get your council house, and that was your goal. And you might judge me for that, but I was poor of opportunity and poor of values and poor of money, and there's differences across the three things. And so for me, what helped me was having the security of my benefits, while I was able to explore adult education opportunities, and they were free, while I was attending family resource centres, community places. So no threat to the security of my benefit was really important for me. What I've seen over the years is, I suppose, people who are trying to escape poverty, especially in adulthood, maybe exploring the opportunity of education. But there's a cost to that financially, in terms of losing benefits or losing access to supports, or there's a trade-off between systems. And that is really harmful for people who are in that 5%. I'm the 5%. That's what I'm talking about, is that 5% of people who are in long-term entrenched poverty. And we are the most costly in terms of society. So in terms of mental health, prison supports, we're the ones that cost the most money to society. So I think security in terms of benefits was really, really important for me, and making sure that I didn't lose anything while I was actually exploring the supports and services that were in place.
Thank you. Professor.
I guess we've seen that through purposeful policies you can dramatically reduce child poverty, and then all of that action can be very quickly undone. I guess from a public health perspective, the 10-year English health inequalities strategy, which was implemented when New Labour came in, it's seen as the largest and longest lasting experiment in trying to reduce social inequalities in health at scale. And it was cross-governmental, and it involved a whole range of factors, targets around inequalities, resource allocation in more disadvantaged areas, particularly through the NHS, area-based regeneration, changes to the tax and benefit system, so the minimum wage, the establishment of Sure Start, which we've heard a lot about already, and then focused support on adult chronic diseases. And it's clear, we've done some of the papers, my colleague Ben Barr and Margaret Whitehead published a paper in the BMJ showing how the strategy worked to narrow social inequalities in life expectancy and also in infant mortality. So in terms of having targets around child poverty and concrete action to reduce child poverty linked to all of these other anti-poverty actions, it's clear that that was very effective. And then we've seen the converse with austerity policies, where 40 billion was removed from the social welfare benefit. We know that it's the two-child limit that's the main driver of children being in poverty, and the single most important thing that we could address in order to overcome that. And at the same time, we saw cuts to services like Sure Start that protect children in the early years, and we saw much bigger cuts in the most disadvantaged areas. And we've done a range of studies, which I hope to be able to talk about, showing the adverse health effects of that reversal, that policy reversal, on numerous aspects of children's health and also adults' health.
Thank you very much. Mike.
Thank you. I had lots of facts about what happened in the 2010s, but I realised they were from a paper written by Tom, so I might let him say them. And maybe I'll focus on the New Labour years. The New Labour government massively increased spending on families with children through the social security system, and in a report last month we estimated that was £40 billion in today's terms, comparing the end of their 13 years, the start of their 13 years. Now that's on families with children overall, right? Not families in poverty. Much of that would have gone on what was going on universal child benefit and on their progressive universalism of tax credits. But that was a huge amount of money and incredibly important in supporting the incomes of low-income families with children. I've got two sort of buts to that. One was that the pattern was not sort of uniform across the 13 years in which New Labour was in power. Much of that increased spending came in the first parliamentary term, or the first 5 or 6 years, and after that the money seemed to run out and progress was a lot less impressive. So it really was the late 90s, early 2000s where the New Labour government did the most. And the second one was that it actually had to spend a lot of money increasing benefits for low-income families and children just to kind of keep poverty standing still, as it were. So this was a time when the economy was growing dramatically, average real earnings were growing strongly, and with a relative poverty measure, that means the poverty line is rising rapidly. So yes, what the New Labour government did lower child poverty compared to it doing nothing, but if it had done nothing, child poverty would have gone up. So that's very much a story of spending the proceeds of growth. Growth was strong, tax revenues were buoyant, and the New Labour government was able to direct a lot of that into social security for families with children, principally through the tax credits.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I would say following on from that, the experience of the 2010s, in one sense, was the inverse, in that we had cuts to benefits, which tends to push up child poverty for obvious reasons. But actually, the increases to child poverty we saw were not as large as many people had expected. And it seems like part of what was going on there was exactly the kind of opposite phenomenon to what Mike was describing in the 2000s, was earnings growth was pretty poor. And so that means that the poverty line isn't racing away as much. And actually there was lots of employment growth. So there was lots of workless families were becoming working families. And so that meant that despite the cuts to benefits, the increase in child poverty, though there was an increase in relative child poverty, it wasn't perhaps as much as you might have expected. I think on Sure Start, one interesting thing about Sure Start is we've got quite good evidence on its effects. I think that's part of why it gets a lot of attraction. There's lots of other things where we just don't really have as strong evidence. And to some extent, it depends a little bit about what do you mean by poverty. And we'll probably get into this a bit later. But Sure Start seems to have had positive impacts on educational outcomes for the kids, health outcomes for the kids, for example. But in terms of income poverty, it doesn't have particularly large impacts in the way that sort of changing the social security regime does. And so there's an important sort of aspect here, and we need to pin down what we're talking about, I think, to really say what things are most effective at reducing poverty.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Darren Paffy.
Thank you. If we focus on employment support policies, what, in your view, have been the contributions that they've made to tackling child poverty over the last 25 years? Maybe if we start with Tom and go along the line.
Yeah, so if you take the lone parent obligation, so that encouraged, that required lone parents who are out of work to look for a job in order to keep getting their benefits. I think we've got good evidence from that increased employment. But one important aspect about that, and I think that this is in general a risk with employment support policies, is it increased employment in very part-time, quite low-paid work. And so its impact on poverty didn't seem to be quite as dramatic. And that's kind of an important thing, I think, to keep in the background. What kind of work are we pushing people into?
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. I mean, certainly the employment situation of lone parents has changed enormously over the last 2.5 decades, from an employment rate of about 45% when New Labour came into power, and it's now about 20 percentage points higher, about 67%. And there's a story told about the New Labour years, a very positive story told about the New Labour years, where they introduced a new deal for lone parents, which was voluntary a voluntary employment programme, there was more help for childcare, there was a minimum wage, and the idea is all these things work together in harmony, and indeed they do, to get the lone parent employment rate up. But actually the lone parent employment rate went up by just as much in the 2010s as it did in the 2000s. And the 2010s is not a period where we would normally say that the government is introducing lots of supportive measures for lone parents. So the policy Tom described is more of an obligation rather than support. So yes, if you looked at the 2000s, you would definitely say employment support programs can be really helpful for parents with children. But the 2000s, sorry, I'm going back. 2000s tell you that's what 2010s tell you that, as Tom was saying. It may be some obligations and compulsion. It also can make a difference, but also the 2010 was characterised by a period where earnings were low, and I think families were just feeling more pressure to work, and that seems to have put the lone parent employment rate up too. Now, if you'd ask, so that that's. Okay.
I just come in there for a second. Actually, I was one of them lone parents on one of them employment. I used to have to go to the job centre and pretend like I was looking for a job in order to keep my benefits. And I remember going into the job centre and being handed every job was a low-skill job. So when we talk about employment opportunities, we need to think about social mobility and whether we want to keep people in low-income, part-time, precarious work, like lone parents or marginalised groups, or whether we actually want to transform the future of families. And so when we talk about lone parents, we need to give them access to skills and opportunities that allow them to choose good employment that's long-lasting, that's going to transform their families. So for me, nobody actually noticed that I'm extremely intelligent and I have the potential to be a professor and work in a university because of my poverty. And so I think any employment programme needs to consider social mobility and how do we recognise talent exists everywhere and opportunity doesn't, and empower people to actually become mobile. And we need to focus primarily, lone parents particularly are a really important group, because from my research and from evidence, if we empower a mother with skills, we actually transform the future of their family. So if we're thinking long-term eradication of poverty, lone parents and women in the household are the most important group to actually give opportunities to high skills and good employment.
Okay, thanks.
I mean, I guess to add to that, 72% of children who are poor are in households where at least somebody's working. So, but at the moment, employment isn't the way out of poverty, and that's a big problem. And we know the two-child limit and the changes to social security have been the main drivers of child poverty. Again, speaking from a public health perspective, employment is clearly a major determinant of population health and of children's health, but only under the right circumstances. So you have to think of the consequences of pushing a lone parent into employment, into a low-paid, insecure job that damages mental health. We know that that's bad, very bad for children's mental health. So, and I work at the University of Copenhagen, where they have very high levels of maternal employment, and there's high-quality universal kindergarten provision at the end of every road, staffed by people with qualifications in child development. And in that context, you can be very happy sending your children to childcare, knowing that they're going to achieve good outcomes. So it's not just about the employment figures; it's also about as you said, the whole of society, and then thinking about the productivity of those children subsequently, which I can come to.
So if I'm hearing right, you're saying that employment support policies have shifted the dial on employment figures, but not necessarily overall on child poverty itself. Is that because of the nature of those particular policies, or is that because that category of policy alone can never achieve that? Or do you think it is feasible for employment support to shift the dial on child poverty?
I think if the employment support is focused on social mobility and empowering people to participate in good quality employment, definitely. I don't think it should be penalising though. So the idea that we need to penalise people for not engaging in employment opportunities. I think that's a flawed approach and actually separates people from employment and eradicates trust. But I definitely think employment programs, if they are focused on high quality employment, I think they have the potential to empower families to move out of poverty long term and it be intergenerational.
And it sounds like you're saying it has to be about employment and the skills development.
The skills, yeah, and the opportunities, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Manuela Pertigella.
So I would like to focus now on the raft of changes proposed in the Pathways to Work Green Paper. So the government's own impact assessment of the planned reforms to health and disability benefits suggests that this will increase child poverty. But the government has also claimed that this will be offset by any increase in employment. So do you find this claim persuasive, or will these cuts become another drive for child poverty? And I'll start with Tom.
So an important part of the context here is that the people who are on health-related benefits, only about a quarter of them have children. And so to a large extent, those that are going to be affected by these policies don't have kids, and so it won't have any direct, for them, doesn't have any direct impact on child poverty. And yeah, the government's estimates are overall poverty goes up by 250,000, of which 50,000 is child poverty, which is a relatively small change in child poverty. You know, it's a tenth of the size of the effect of removing the two-child limit, for example. So it's I think it's mostly worth thinking of this as affecting childless adults. And that's those numbers, those 50,000, 250,000 numbers, those are before accounting for any impacts on employment. I think it's pretty optimistic to think that you would be able to get an employment effect from that would more than offset 50,000. We don't have an estimate from the OBR yet about how much the increase in employment would be, but kind of based on estimates from previous reforms, we're talking about policies that are going to affect, you know, potentially millions of claimants, and probably the employment effects will be in the tens of thousands. So it seems unlikely that would be able to offset the direct loss of income from benefit cuts.
I think I agree with Tom that the changes to disability benefits will mean very large losses for some families, but there aren't actually that many children in those families, and so it's a little bit of it's not the most important thing when it comes to thinking about child poverty. But you also asked about the employment effects. By coincidence, we have some research published this morning, which obviously Tom hasn't seen, which is fair enough, where we did try and do what the OBR didn't do and try to estimate what the employment effects would be. I mean, our number was about 100,000 more people in work if you on the most optimistic scenario. So thinking about the cuts to PIP and thinking about the changes to universal credit health element. But they've got a massive unknown, though, in what the government set out is what is the nature of the extra employment support it's promising. And that's probably got the potential to really move that number, 100,000, a long way if they were to invest or spend the money on the best possible employment support for people with health and disabilities. But at the moment, the government's given us no details of what that is, and the extra money is very, very backloaded towards the end of the Parliament. So the figure I gave of 100,000 is by the end of the Parliament. But with half the extra money for employment support is coming in the final year of the Parliament, we can't expect that to radically transform the employment rate for disabled people by the end of the Parliament, if you see what I mean.
I think there are a number of risks. There's a risk that the policies increase poverty, that they have effects on health and well-being, and that they may improve employment outcomes. So we know there's an intersection between children living in poverty and adults with disability. So a third of all children in the UK live in a family that contains at least one disabled person. We also know that 44% of families living with a disabled person are kids are likely to be poor. So that intersection is important. We know from the impact assessment that between 50,000 and 100,000 more children will be pushed into poverty as a result of the strategy, which is not great when you're trying to implement a child poverty strategy to do the opposite. Health Equity North, the organisation that I co-direct, has looked at where those cuts to PIP will fall, and they predominantly take money out of the economy from northern areas where there are high levels of social disadvantage, the areas that have already been hit by COVID, the pandemic, and austerity measures. So in terms of levelling up interventions, it doesn't look very promising from that respect. And then we've also, my colleague Ben Barr, who presented at the Select Committee last week, has done previous work on the work capability assessment and other changes to welfare benefits that have restricted eligibility and focused on conditionality. We showed large mental health impacts, negative mental health impacts, suicides, antidepressant prescriptions, and what was the other outcome? And cases of mental health. And another study that we published showed that the strategy didn't move people into employment, and indeed systematic reviews of similar strategies have shown that there's not very strong evidence that these measures have positive effects on people returning to the labour market. So I think there are lots of risks inherent in what we're seeing with disability benefit cuts.
I think, I don't know if it'll have a good or a bad effect on child poverty or on employment rates. What I do know is the rhetoric around cutting benefits makes assumptions about why people are on benefits. And it was briefly mentioned in the last session, everybody wants a better life. Everybody wants a fulfilled life. Everybody wants to achieve happiness. And so the idea of cutting benefits is suggesting that people are making bad choices and that they are, and we have consistently underserved communities for many, many generations, which has made them benefit dependent in some cases. And then to penalise that and to suggest that that's going to increase their likelihood of moving to an employment. I think we just need to be careful about the language that we use and how we pathologise people who've been socialised into state dependency for many, many generations because of lack of opportunity. And so I'd just be concerned about what we assume about people, because there's an assumption also with poor people, or poor people like me, that we don't want a better life, that we want to stay on benefits, that we want to be served all the time. If I could have chose this life, if I knew how wonderful it is to have and to be educated and employed wonderfully, I would have chose it at any moment. But I didn't have that choice at the end of the day. So I just think we need to be careful about the communication and what we communicate to people when we talk about benefit cuts. The assumption is that they're on benefits because they don't want to be employed or they don't want to have a better life. So I just would be mindful of that.
Moving on to Amanda Hag.
Thank you, Chair. Just wanted to move back to education and the types of policies and interventions that have been the most important to help children in poverty remain and access education. So I wondered if you could give me a view on those policy measures.
For me, I've got a list. What changed my life was education, was the education I received here. Was having teachers who were qualified, who understood what poverty and trauma looks like within the classroom, were able to educate me with that knowledge. And so early education is really essential for people who are living in poor communities. 20 hours per week at 3 to 4 years of age would be the ideal. We need to reform the funding formula, give more money back to the schools. When we were giving schools who are serving disadvantaged communities more money, that we were having better outcomes in terms of education. We need to make sure no child is going hungry. We need to, all children on universal credit should get free school meals. We need to reinstate that. Reducing segregation in terms of admissions policies, funding evidence-based practices within education, but the best teachers in the worst schools. So we definitely need to ensure that our teachers who are working in schools, so ideal world, we'd reduce poverty within the family and family and communities where we would restore, but that's going to take generations to do that. So the biggest place where a child spends its time, hopefully if they go, is school. So that's the place in the younger age where we need to do the most work. And in the most disadvantaged communities, we need to have outstanding educators. And what I mean by outstanding educators, they need to have small class sizes, ensure that they understand poverty and what it presents like, that when you're a naughty kid, you are a clever kid. It just means that maybe you're struggling with whatever's going on at home. And then restore pupil premiums. I definitely think that worked. There's lots of evidence that it worked. And expand it to post-16. So that's some of my experiences. And just allow teachers to care. One of the responses to me telling my story has been the overwhelming education response of teachers who can't care the way they want to for poor children because they're restricted by the pressures within the education system because of the changes in the last 10 or 15 years. So allow teachers to lead and change and care in the school system. And we just need one adult. A child just needs one good adult to place a light in them. That light guides them for their life. It becomes an attachment figure. That's what I got. Miss Arkinson, I'll mention her. She was the first, and then there was Mr. Pickering, and then there was Miss Lockwood. And we just need to make sure that our educators are allowed to do the work that they want to do. And the bad ones, we get rid of them. I can tell you how to do that as well, but I probably shouldn't while I'm on TV.
Thank you, really powerful, thank you.
Yeah, we, building on what Katriona said, I think I spoke to all of the head teachers in Liverpool recently, and we looked at some of the data on education. I think a life course perspective to these things is clearly critical because a lot of the damage to children's life chances, as we know, is done in the early years, and it's related to poverty and the home environment. We're working on a study at the moment looking at the ages and stages data, which is collected on all 2.5-year-old children. We see children impacted by COVID, more children having problems with communication, not achieving a good level of development. So there's a cohort of kids coming through. There are large inequalities. That tracks into school readiness. We're seeing increasing regional north-south divide in attainment at different levels, including GCSE and A levels. So we're seeing increasing educational inequalities. The same issues that applied to local authority budgets applied to schools. So we saw the biggest cuts to educational budgets in the most disadvantaged areas. We're working on we've submitted a study that looks at the natural experiment of the change in educational funding and how that's impacted GCSE results in England. And we show an effect of those cuts to funding, which has particularly hit large secondary schools in places like Liverpool. Big budget cuts to schools. It's affected educational outcomes. So teachers have, they want to they want to improve children's life chances, but are struggling because of the poverty outside the school doors. And the number one pressures, the two things that teachers speak about are the increasing spend on special educational needs and mental health problems, which are related to levels of child poverty, which means that we need funding proportionate to need across the life course to support children's development in, first of all, Sure Start and early years, and then in the school system.
Thank you. Helen Hayes. Thank you. So I just wanted to ask Professor O'Sullivan, so I've read your book, and in your book you write very, very powerfully about the teachers that you've mentioned who really saw you as a human individual and did their job in helping you and providing what you needed. And you write about some other professionals along the way as well who really were transformative in the impact that they had on your life. But you also write in a really devastating way about some professionals who didn't see you as a child in need. So you write about the ambulance drivers who attended your father when he was overdosing, who looked at you and judged you as a child rather than looking at you as a child in desperate need and seeing that. So my question is, what are the changes that are needed to ensure that professionals across the board are doing the best that they can and the roles that they need to play to help children in poverty?
I think the most... So I wrote my book, my parents were heroin addicts. The two of them were poor. My mum was poor, her mum was poor, her mum was poor before her. Poverty reproduced itself like privilege does. And so there's no blame. And heroin addiction was their management of the hurt. And it's a mental health difficulty, not a bad choice. Just to say that. But my hurts during my childhood was actually more from the services and the supports outside of my home than actually my parents' addiction. So policemen holding up underwear in my house and saying, look, my mum's dirty underwear, and saying, look at the state of your mother. Or ambulance men roughing my dad when he's overdosed, ignoring me at 7, telling me my dad was a dog. Or our teachers actually refusing to teach me because I didn't sit still with my fingers on my lips, as you're supposed to. And so I think one thing as an adult who actually woke up through education, I'm surprised at how little people know about poverty and what it actually looks like in human beings, especially people in services, frontline services. So the lack of training for police, for ambulance men, for you, policymakers, around what actual real poverty looks like and how if it manifests. It manifests in difficult people. We don't follow rules. We're not easy to deal with. You know, I would fight you. Not anymore. Just don't worry. So the reality of meeting services that didn't understand that we weren't making bad choices was really harmful to me and to my family. And the harm was it made me very difficult to access services when I needed them, because you're all kind of the same, kind of modest people, privileged, you know, people who work in services. There's the same kind of middle class group that works in services, which is wonderful, but because of the negative experiences, it made it very difficult for me to access services. The services that I would access were community services, because they're a bit of me, and I trusted them more than I did people like you. Maybe not all of you, but that was the truth. So I would suggest that it's actually compulsory for people in services, supports, to be trained and understand what poverty looks like. And I'm talking about long-term intergenerational poverty. I'm not talking about situational or employment poverty. I'm talking about the 5%. The ones of us that use the services all the time, that are in prisons, in social services, in care. So that would be the other thing. That the most important thing is to educate people. And the other thing that really shocked me as an adult was how we allow teachers particularly to continue to teach when they're not very good. And they actually are harming young people, and how we're kind of complicit in that. So I would really, really be calling for, especially in schools with high concentration of disadvantage, that we really ensure that teachers understand poverty, but are actually able to care and be kind and understanding within them circumstances. Because like one bad teacher can actually rob you of school, and it has done for many of my friends. For me, I was very lucky that the couple, the bad ones I had, but didn't steal it from me. But I would say that we definitely educate people on poverty and make sure that if they're on the front line, that they understand that we're not bad people who are making bad choices. That would be really important.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Caroline Johnson. I'm just conscious we've got just under a quarter of an hour before we are due to finish. So again, succinct questions and answers, please, colleagues.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to ask about education. We've talked about the importance of education in giving everyone an opportunity to achieve their best in life. The attainment gap fell quite considerably between 2010 and 2020, but since the pandemic, perhaps because children's access to education was quite different during the pandemic and the school closures, has started to rise again. How can the government best get on top of that so the attainment gap reduces and people get the best opportunity to thrive?
I'm happy to make a start with that question. So we've been doing work on children not in education, employment or training, so-called NEET, and it builds on work that I've been involved with in Denmark. So if you'll allow me to describe what we did in the Danish population, in Denmark, because there's linked data, you can look at all the types of experiences that children face as they're growing up, and then outcomes in later life. So in the Danish population, we were able to characterise children's experience of poverty and other adversities, and then we looked at how that affected, first of all, survival. So we had a paper in the Lancet showing that child poverty affects survival. If you're just transiently exposed to poverty, it increases your risk of death. And then we've gone on to do studies showing impacts on chronic disease over the life course. The latest, there's 2 papers out recently in the Lancet and in Social Science and Medicine that show those same adversities drive high levels of social welfare use and NEAT and inequalities in educational attainment in the Danish population. So that evidence in that population shows that if you want to address mental health problems, welfare dependency, young people not transitioning into the labour market, you need to address trajectories of poverty and the adversity that comes with that poverty. And so we've done the same in UK data, and we see the same thing. So we've done a study now looking at NEAT in the Millennium Cohort study, and we show that children growing up in poverty who also experience family mental health problems have 5 times the odds of being NEAT in the UK population. Again, if we want to address the tidal wave of mental health problems that we're dealing with at the moment that affect educational outcomes, that affect transition into the labour market, the data is crystal clear. We need to address child poverty, and we know exactly how to do that.
Really about the attainment gap. We saw the attainment gap fall consistently over 10 years between 2010 and 2020, up until the pandemic. So what do you think drove that change, and how do we reverse the trend since the pandemic for the attainment gap to widen?
I think there's been cuts, though, to disadvantaged schools in recent times, to the funding disadvantaged schools, the reduction of the pupil premium funding. So I think maybe what we're seeing now is the consequences of that. And I think the rise from 2010 to 2020 might have been because of investment prior to that. I definitely think school attainment is just one piece of a really big puzzle. I think definitely with COVID, what we're seeing is high rates of absenteeism. School refusal is a horrible term, but sometimes that's kind of an adaptive response actually for young people, because they're not necessarily getting their needs met within the education system. I think back to empower it. So if we're looking at the attainment gap has always been an issue. So we've never reduced it. There's always been a gap between the rich and the poor in terms of the outcomes. So I think ideally what we need to do is make sure that schools are places where students want to go and learn. And continue to learn in, and where they're supported to do that, and the school is supported to do it really well. What I would suggest is there are really good evidence. There's really good evidence that of what works in disadvantaged communities around increasing attainment. And so if we want to do that, so if we go to the Sutton Trust, for example, they've lots of evidence which will show how you can increase attainment and reduce the distance. So I would suggest, for policy making, what we need to do is use evidence-based practice to try to implement what's working in some communities and transfer it across all the schools where the gap is there. But also then I'm also thinking about where can you go afterwards, because sometimes the supports stop post 16. So where can we, what's the value in reducing the gap if the opportunities for social mobility afterwards are not necessarily there for young people? I'd also think that the cost of higher education might be another issue in terms of devaluing attainment, because where can you go afterwards with this big cost in terms of progressing elsewhere?
Thank you. I'm going to ask the next question, if that's all right. It's firstly to Professor Taylor Robinson. I came across a quote which we heard from Margaret Whitehead and Goran Dahlgren. So, no law of nature decrees that children of poor families should die at twice the rate as children born into rich families. So, in terms of these health inequalities, we've known about that. That was a quote from 2006. We've known about that for a long time. But how has that changed with the increase in child poverty in recent years?
I think it's clear that inequalities have mirrored the changes that we've seen in spending, and we've done a number of studies showing the impact of austerity on a whole range of children's outcomes, and it's been devastating. So one of the first studies to show a causal effect of changing child poverty on infant mortality was one that we led. It was published in the BMJ, and it showed that there'd been continuous reduction in infant mortality and reductions in inequalities, which were related to the English health inequalities strategy. And then they reversed in around 2012, 2013, and we saw a rise in infant mortality and a stagnation subsequently. That was caused partially by the rise in child poverty. We calculate 600 infant deaths over just over a 3-year period as child poverty rose. And still we see that we've fallen down rankings when it comes to children's mortality. OECD rankings, we're towards the bottom of the infant mortality rankings. This report, which we did, looked at the latest data on infant mortality, and shows that we've seen 14 years stagnation of the inequalities gap in infant mortality. And that's just one health outcome. Just to summarise what we're seeing at the moment for children's health, we're seeing rising inequality in infant mortality, life expectancy at birth, healthy life expectancy, the modern epidemics of childhood, so rising inequalities in obesity, child mental health problems, rising inequalities in maternal mortality, women dying in pregnancy, rising inequalities in children being taken into the care system, in educational attainment and vaccination uptake. So it's a sorry story, and we can track many of those rising inequalities back to rising poverty and cuts to preventative services that support children. That's not to mention the trends that we've seen in adult health, where pre-pandemic we saw stalling life expectancy going backwards, particularly in women in the poorest areas, that again we've shown were strongly related to austerity measures.
Thank you. Lots of discussion in terms of needs, not young people not in education, employment or training. And I wondered if you wanted to comment in terms of the relationship with poverty, and particularly young people's mental health.
Yeah, so building on the answer earlier, so we've looked at, I guess the changes to disability benefits are being driven by the large rise in young people with mental health problems. So that's what's concerning the Treasury. That same population is the population that we study in Millennium Cohort Study. So those young people are 25 now. Millennium is a nationally representative study. And we can clearly see the impact of poverty and adversity on the risk of all sorts of outcomes for children in Millennium. We've done a range of studies, and we've characterised the main adversities that children face growing up in Millennium. 40% of kids are either exposed to persistent poverty or persistent parental mental health problems, or a combination of both. And
40%?
40%. So 20% of kids in Millennium always in poverty, 10% always exposed to parental mental health problems, another 10% exposed to both. And it's those adversities that drive, for example, mental health problems. So we show that kids in the group where they're exposed to poverty and parental mental health problems are 8 times more likely to develop mental health problems themselves. And then we've looked at NEAT, and again that's strongly related to those adversity trajectories. We calculate population attributable fractions around that estimate, and if you believe the analysis, it suggests that you could reduce the proportion of children who are NEAT by about half if you reduced levels of poverty and adversity. And those Danish studies that I've talked about show clearly in the Danish population that it's poverty and childhood adversity that drive mental health problems in children, and that partially explains the reason why those young people don't transition into the labour market, and they're the same young people that have high intensity use of social welfare system, healthcare system and criminal justice system. And I think this is a really important body of evidence.
Debbie, can I just add there that it was mental health supports that actually saved me from... So I was given lots of opportunities to move out of poverty. I know this is not about my story, but it was only when I was able to engage in free local mental health supports that I was actually able to take the opportunities to engage in the wonderful practices and policies that were on offer to me when I was actually looking to get better. And so mental health supports are like fundamental. This is not employment and education and finances are not the only thing in this. We actually need to ensure that because poverty is a trauma within itself, and so when you live in long-term stress, it affects your capabilities mentally. It changes your biology. We know that in psychology, and therefore it's really important that we actually offer supports and services and policies around mental health that go in hand with any employment or education policies.
Thank you. Mike and Tom, do you want to comment on?
I can't think of work related to child poverty, but a year or two ago we finished a 2-year programme of work looking at young people in the labour market and mental health and showing all the connections. And yes, of course, mental health is getting worse and worse for 18 to 25-year-olds. And yes, there is a strong link between that and their labour force experience. But what struck me the most was when we did some of our qualitative work with them. So we went to talk to young people with mental health problems who are not working, and so many of them went back to their school years. And this was not to do with COVID. So these were people who were hit by COVID when they were young adults. Their schooling was pre-COVID. And so many spoke about the fact that their mental health problems began when they were in school and, of course, weren't addressed properly or weren't addressed satisfactorily. And then when you do the transition from being a dependent to an adult, then your ability to access mental health services becomes even harder. So yes, I think schools have a great deal of work to do in providing mental health support that can then help prevent the next generation of needs.
I think on mental health, one important aspect here is if you look at people getting disability benefits, we've seen increase in people getting it for mental health reasons across the board. So you do see it amongst younger people all the way up to state pension age. We've seen a notable shift up, and so that suggests that there's something broader going on. You know, this has all happened over a very short space of time, over the course of just a few years. And you know, all these the relationships, of course, between young people's outcomes, young adults' outcomes, I mean to say, and where they grew up, their childhood circumstances, those correlations are very well established. I think one thing that makes it very difficult for policy is it's very difficult to separate those correlations out into how much of it is causal, and that makes it hard to know what the right direction is for policy.
Thank you. Caroline Bowden.
Thank you, Chair. So this question is to Katriona, and can I just say how powerful it is to sit here and listen to your testimony, because it makes such a difference to really hear from somebody who has actually lived this, you know, you've made those changes in your life, and it's really good for us to learn from your experience. So we know that children growing up in poverty are much more likely to be taken into care. And you've written yourself in your book about the impact of your parents' substance misuse and mental health issues. So could I just ask you, how do you think the system can best support? I mean, it's a huge question, but maybe, you know, in a nutshell, what do you think is the most effective way that the system can support families that are in entrenched poverty?
Oh, it's a really... Have you got an hour? Or 2 or 10? Just to say, I had a really wonderful experience in care. So it was one of the best experiences of my childhood when I was taken into care. I think I should have been kept in care. And one of the challenges that I have as an adult is why I wasn't. And I think we've swung the other way, a little bit more the other way now, whereas maybe people are being taken into care too easily. So obviously family support, community support. So one of the flaws, I think, with all of poverty work is the charitable mindset that goes along with it, as if we need to be saved. When I went to Trinity College, I was taken to the National Gallery to learn about art, because I needed to be culturised into the middle class way. No one recognised that there was skill and talent in my community. And poverty, if you don't die from it, actually forges talent and a type of skill that is not always evident. So I definitely think how we talk about poverty, how we consider people who are poor, the language we use about being saved or taken out of our communities, that needs to be challenged, because we're great people and I had great role models. So I think when we talk, you know, from a policy point of view and how we pitch this work, but I think for me, actually having some people in my community that I could access and actually go and talk about what was happening with me in an honest, trusting way was really, really important. And I think that would have been really helpful to my mum as well. I think good treatment, medical support. So not having to wait for rehab if you're a drug addict, not having to wait for medical supports. Generally, a person who's addicted because of poverty, they will ask for help, especially a mother, and we have such long waiting lists and such inadequate services for people when they do ask for help in terms of their medical, especially addiction. That can be really problematic. I mean, for me, I think I had one adult who really believed in me, and I think if we can provide that to children and adults, whether it's through community work, family hubs, Sure Starts, whatever it is, if we could just think about making sure that there's beacons of light across people's lives, it would really help. And I would always have responded to people from my community, who are in my community. I think the loss of adult education and community investment has been a big gap for someone like me, that 5%. You know, you got to think differently for the different types of poverty. Financial poverty is different to poverty of value. My values differed. So like I wasn't going to respond to an activation program, or I wasn't going to, you know, I needed to be, my hands needed to be held, and I needed to find someone who I trusted and someone who believed in me. I don't know if that is a good enough answer, but I think in all the supports and the services that we have need to have good people who believe in our potential, who recognise that we're talented and excellent, who don't try to middle class us and change us.
Grassroots funding in communities.
I think community funding is a big thing. The cut in community funding, for me, if I wouldn't be here, I wouldn't have been able to change my life today. So if I had asked for help today, I wouldn't be here. This great person that I am, this professor, this published in Nature, 3 million in funding, I wouldn't be here because the supports and services have been completely cut. Community, childcare, free education, second chances, someone mentioned it earlier, the chance to fail. I always think about, I'll finish on this, I know I'm waffling, privileged children get the opportunity to try things and fail. My son is trying at university and he doesn't really like it, and I'm going to support him to try something else. We need to be affording the same opportunities to kids that are poor, and we need to be doing it in a meaningful way where we know there's talent in that pool of people and giving them opportunities. So I don't know, but one good adult.
And in a word, can I just ask you, do you think all teachers should be trained in trauma?
I don't think it's very buzzwordy, trauma informed. I definitely think teachers that work in, I think we need to ensure that our teachers' values are good and they align with what we want. And I think that's an issue. We don't actually always recruit teachers based on their values. The Nordic model of how they recruit teachers is excellent. It's reduced the distance. They got rid of private education and they changed how they recruit teachers. And that reduced the distance between the rich and the poor. And the rich didn't go downwards, the poor went upwards. So I definitely think we need to educate teachers about poverty, but I don't like the buzzwords, trauma informed. It needs to be real and meaningful.
Did you want to quickly come in, if you may?
We showed that rising child poverty has caused 10,000 extra children to enter care between 2015 and 2020. That's again published in The Lancet. These are causal effects, and the short-term cost of that, just for local authorities, was 1.4 billion. It's the number one cost pressure on local authorities. And that pays, you could avoid all of that by reducing child poverty. That pays for, half of getting rid of the 2-child limit. And it shows the false economy of running a society with high levels of child poverty.
Thank you. Very briefly, Jo Baxter.
Will be very brief. I have been really moved by your testimony, particularly Katriona, particularly what you were saying about teachers being able to believe in kids, and it was Dr. Vincent Oates for me, so thank you. But the question is just, what measures and indicators of poverty have been most useful in work to reduce child poverty? So whoever wants to, very briefly, give me a quick response.
I think this gets to the point of what do we really mean by poverty, and obviously we often talk about income poverty, and one natural reason to do that is it's comparatively easier to measure. and that's what New Labour's child poverty targets were based upon. I think there's a good case for that. Income captures a lot of things. It isn't everything, but it's not going to be possible to have a measure which captures absolutely everything. One thing I think is worth thinking about is the headline poverty measures. Something on the order of a third of children, for example, are in relative poverty. You could move a bunch of people from just below the poverty line to just above, and potentially get that number down quite a bit. But in real terms, it wouldn't be massively affecting the lives of those children. Their income's only gone up by a small amount. And so it's worth considering, I think, deep poverty as well. And particularly, thinking about kind of scrutinising the government on their strategy is a situation we certainly wouldn't want to be in is where the government sort of is gaming that entirely arbitrary threshold. There's nothing magic about the poverty line. It doesn't have any particular grounding, and so I think it's worth considering not just those headline measures, but also thinking about deeper poverty too.
Thank you.
Caroline, very briefly, if that's all right.
For the big question at the end, maybe I could ask all of you just very briefly, what is your view of the government's current child poverty strategy? What areas should we as a committee be focusing on? And given the high levels of child poverty, how likely do you think it is that the government can deliver significant change in the short and long term? It's a huge question.
Well, the government hasn't yet got a child poverty strategy, right? It's still thinking about it, and it's going to tell us the answer later this year. So that's that. I can duck that question, but I think I think the ministers involved have got a very tough task. Our modelling shows that relative child poverty is set to rise over the Parliament if the government does nothing, and that is essentially because of the cuts to social security that are baked into the forecast, whether they come from not uprating local housing allowance or the continued rollout of the two-child limit. So I think they have a very tough task ahead of them, and what we've seen from how DWP and the Treasury seem to have been negotiating behind the scenes about welfare cuts suggests that it's going to be difficult for the DWP to persuade the Treasury to spend much money on the child poverty threat. So I think the situation does seem fairly bleak at the moment, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Tom?
I would say one smaller but actually think potentially quite important thing is we might not know if they've succeeded, because it's certainly if we're talking about income poverty, the way in which that's measured is from a survey called the Family Resources Survey, and unfortunately that's got the quality of that survey, the number of people responding to it and the representativeness of those responding to it has got much worse since the pandemic, and it's at the moment we don't really actually have a very clear idea of what child poverty is, and if that continues, we simply won't know if they've met their targets or not.
As a child public health doctor, it's baffling that we let an exposure as toxic as child poverty wash over a third of kids. It makes absolutely no sense from a public policy perspective, and I'm optimistic. We know exactly what we need to do: get rid of the two-child benefit cap, uprate child benefits. It's clear what needs to be done to reverse that, and that will reap huge benefits for society. The consequences of not doing that are increasing mental health problems, welfare dependency, and all of the things that we've discussed. So I think the stakes are very high, but I'm optimistic that if the policy goes large, it can, ambitious social transformation and achieving those missions will cost a little bit of money.
Invest to save.
I think I'm really grateful to be here. It shows that you are definitely considering, really meaningfully considering what happens next in terms of child poverty. So for me, I would be happy to say that I'm glad that you're doing that. I think in terms of we need to think about income and the measures for today, but also I think social mobility is a really important indicator. So it's like how are we transforming the future of people's lives as well. And if I was thinking about success, I'd be measuring that. Like I'm a geeky academic, and we have lots of measures of poverty that don't just look at the blunt income, because I actually think income is a kind of a very small part in some cases. It adds stress, but for me, actually values and your ability to access opportunities. So if I was looking at like measures of success, I'd be looking at school completion, progressing to higher education, Russell Group higher education, not necessarily any higher education. So I'd be looking at skills and access to skills and high status professional development, high status employment opportunities for people who are coming from poorer communities. So I'd be definitely looking at social mobility, because what we want is an eradication of poverty. We don't want just to reduce it now and increase income for this generation. We want the future of people to change, and we do that by implementing education, employment, skills, financial health supports, and mental health supports. And so I would advise you to look across the board and include education, employment, skills in your plans, and include social mobility as a metric for the future, rather than just the blunt indicator of at risk of poverty or in poverty. Thank you.
And that concludes our rather long session this morning, but I think it's been incredibly valuable. Thank you so much to all of you for providing evidence to us today. Order, order.